Thank you for joining us. We are on location at the Mayfair Hotel in London, England, to cover a couple of topics on tourism and other, but also matters of interest specifically to the Jewish community. Our guest today is author William Kaczynski, who will tell us of his experiences prior to World War II and the book he's written on Holocaust remembrance and related topics following these messages. With us now is William Kaczynski. Mr. Kaczynski, it's a pleasure and privilege and an honor to have you with us today.
Likewise, it's an honor for me to be interviewed by you. Hopefully it'll go to many people who are interested to learn more about the Holocaust, and together with my book Fleeing from the Fuhrer, which has got 150 photos of my collection of envelopes and postcards from refugees from World War II, validates many of the things that happened.
Speaking of honors and privileges, I understand that you had the honor of meeting Prince Charles and offered your book. In fact, you have a copy here for me.
Yes, this is the book, Fleeing from the Fuhrer. It's about my collection of envelopes and postcards from refugees from World War II. I was a refugee myself and came over 6 weeks before the war from Berlin, and I was then interned on the Isle of Man. And I came across an envelope addressed to my mother, who was interned on the Isle of Man, from a cousin in Canada who was interned there. And I thought, this is interesting. I wonder how many internment camps there were on the Isle of Man, and there were 11, and I started collecting them. But then I found that the British Empire was very large and had all around the world internment camps for enemy aliens, as I was. And I started collecting these just for pleasure. And the British Library heard one of my talks that I gave about my envelopes, and they said, it's such an important collection, we will sponsor you to put it in a book. And together with Professor Charmaine Vinson, who is a professor of German studies at the Imperial College of London, helped me put the book together, and it took 4 years. And it's been a terrific success. We've sold in the first few months nearly 2,000, and I've got letters from the Holocaust head of the Holocaust Educational Trust in London, who are suggesting that it should go into schools. And just 2 Mondays ago, on the 24th of June, a little while ago, I was invited to meet Prince Charles at a reception he was holding for Kindertransport children at St. James's Palace.
How interesting that is. In fact, it so happens my parents were on the Kindertransport, escaped from Germany to England just before World War II.
As well. Yes, everybody has a story. What is so fascinating about my book, Fleeing from the Fuhrer, is that it incorporates things like undercover mail, displaced persons mail, people who made a difference like Wallenberg or Sir Nicholas Winton or Sophie Scholl, who was a young girl who in Germany who decided that the regime wasn't right, printed leaflets, of which I've got one, and it's in the book, was caught by the caretaker distributing them at the university in Munich in 1942. The Gestapo came, they had a trial the following day, and the next day they were guillotined. Just some of the things are just unbelievable, of the things. And my book with the 150 photographs of these envelopes and various things, just validates all the things that happened. And I'm hoping tremendously that it'll go into schools. Certainly, Prince Charles was more than charming and interested in what I was telling him about the book. And just yesterday, I received a letter from the palace stating that he is looking forward to reading it. So it's fantastic.
Absolutely. I need to ask you, other than this wonderful honor that you speak of, on one hand we have individuals who recognize the importance of promoting a better understanding of the real history that occurred, the atrocities perpetrated by Nazi Germany. On the other hand, there are people who have the chutzpah, the insolence, to actually deny that the Holocaust took place. What are your feelings regarding those people?
They usually are fairly uneducated, except for David Irving, who was proved wrong. There was a court case where he indicated that the Holocaust never happened, went to High Court in England, and it was shown that he was absolutely wrong. It's mostly uneducated people, or very poor people mainly, possibly. And this is why children who are learning about the Holocaust, it's so important that they know about it, that these sort of things don't happen again.
Which brings me to the obvious question as to how would you define the importance of continuing with education so that neither Jew nor Gentile should be anywhere in the world permitted to forget that these atrocities did take place? How important in your mind is education?
The most important, and this is why I'm so very anxious to get this book into schools. It's been recommended that it should go to schools. Unfortunately, schools in England, and there's 7,000 schools in England who are learning about the Holocaust in their lessons. Unfortunately, they don't have sufficient money, and so I will be having to look for a sponsor to buy a paperback edition, which I've organized with the publishers to be really quite cheap.
By the way, we are sitting here in the Mayfair Hotel in London, and there is some background noise. We apologize for that. I'd like to continue and ask you, how do you see the challenges facing the Jewish community as a whole at this time in history in London, for example?
Possibly in London a little easier than Israel. I think Israel has real big headaches to keep going. It's gone for 65 years, which is great. It's fantastic. It is the only democratic country in the Middle East. All round, even today, they're still fighting each other in Egypt, of course in Syria. It's not democratic, and it's the only little country in the Middle East that is democratic, and it's so important to keep. I think in England they do the utmost to publicize this, but maybe not sufficient.
What about anti-Semitism in London?
I haven't really come across it. I did when I was a little younger, but not really. And in fact, I was at school with, when I was about 11, so many years ago, being a refugee, with a refugee from Palestine, an Arab. His name is Ziad Karmi. And in fact, we have still continued to be friends. So I think the most important thing is for children to learn to mix together and learn not to hate each other. And in fact, this Ziad Karmi came to our wedding, and we've been friendly 60, 70 years, which is fantastic. And that's how it should be. It's there are one or two schools in Israel that have got mixed English and Arab schools. I don't think that is the case here in England, where there are quite a number of just Jewish schools, and I don't think that is 100% correct. People have got to mix to be able to learn not to hate each other.
I remember walking on streets in Israel. For example, King George V Street. Britain is honored a lot in Israel today in its brief history, 65 years. And of course, I do agree with you with regard to education, the importance of mixing individuals, having a dialogue, all very important. But I'd like to ask you, do you feel that Muslim terrorism, for example, the murder by some Islamic terrorists not long ago in London, in which a British soldier was killed on the streets, how do you feel terrorism by Muslims is affecting relationships between the Jewish community and others?
I don't think it is. I don't think it is affected. There are always an odd bad apple in the barrel. Although I feel, again, the Muslim community should be more integrated with the Jewish community, in a larger sense than I was with my friend from who was a refugee from Jerusalem in then Palestine in '48. So long as we tend to not talk about Israeli politics, we tend to keep on good terms and have done so for these many years.
People would say you have a very kind and benevolent attitude. Do you feel that people in the Muslim community in London share the same sentiment you do?
Yes. Yes. The few that I've heard on television who condemn the killing of that soldier, I feel sure feel in a similar way as I do, and as my not very religious community in London as they do. We belong to a Reform synagogue in London, and I think most people there feel like I do. Hopefully.
What solutions do you see with regard to bringing the Islamic world and Jewish community closer on a basis of friendship and mutual tolerance and coexistence?
Exactly what they're doing in Israel with a number of institutes that have got children from Arabs, from the Arab and from Israeli children coming together and growing up not hating each other. And there are a number of schools, as far as I know, like that in Israel. I think maybe one is called Peace Now. I'm not sure, but I do know that there are a number of schools like that in Israel, and there should be more. It's a pity that there are not a few like that in the Arab states. But take, for instance, the conductor Barenboim. He has an orchestra of Israeli and Arabs playing the most beautiful music together. What else can one say?
It should be that way throughout, I would say.
It should be.
There is the Arabah Institute in the Israeli desert, the Arabah, in which Arab and Jewish students study together on environmental and agricultural challenges, doing very well, but it's just a small institute. If there were thousands of such initiatives throughout the Arab and Jewish world, but I emphasize the Arab world as well,
Absolutely.
would be a greater basis for optimism.
Absolutely, without question. I couldn't agree more with you. They should all read my book.
Maybe we should have it distributed. This is all very interesting, and I appreciate and respect your thoughts. Please tell us more about yourself.
Right. Well, as I said, I was a 3-year-old child born in Berlin and came to England 6 weeks before the war. Unfortunately, at Kristallnacht, which was November 38, my father was taken to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Unfortunately, a few weeks later, my brother was born. His name is Edward, and all the Jewish doctors were in the concentration camp, and the Christian doctors didn't want to know, and the child dropped on the floor at birth and got a blood clot in his brain and is paralyzed, his right side. But he does well. He drives a car and he's got a family, but he can't lift up a glass of water. So I think my parents had a very hard time, but fortunately, because my father was able to work with his hands, he was a hat manufacturer. He got a job in England where he got a work permit. With that, my mother managed to get him a visa and got him out of the concentration camp. And as I said, we arrived in England in July 39. And I then just started collecting all this material from refugees from World War II. And I wrote a few articles, and I had an article in the New York Sunday Times a few years ago. And I was, quite excited to see my name in New York Sunday Times. And I received a phone call, and they said, hello, is that Mr. Kaczynski? This is CBS Radio Canada. We saw your article in the New York Times. Would you like to give a talk? And I thought, oh, great. They're going to send me over to Canada to give a talk. And they said, oh, good. I'm pleased you want to give a talk. You're on the air. So I had to give a talk about my collection. And I tend to end my talks by saying, I hope you found it interesting. And if you've got any envelopes, please let me know. And this is my address. About 2 weeks later, I get a letter from a guy in Canada. I asked him what sort of profession he was in, and he said classical music. So I said, oh, that's interesting. My mother was a famous opera singer in Berlin, but was stopped from singing in 1934. So he said, well, have you got any of her records? I said, no. So he said, well, why don't you phone International Sound Archives in Munich and see if they've got any records. So I phoned up and I said, you got any records from Edith Bach? That was my mother's maiden name. And they said, just a minute. Yes, from 1928. So I had it sent over, and I've got it framed. But before I had it framed, I had it put onto the CD, which I've got here.
Fascinating.
Isn't that fascinating?
Absolutely.
All through this collecting.
How very interesting.
And not only that, but a little while ago, about a year or so ago, the oldest church in England, called the Temple Church, just off Fleet Street, from about 1100, were holding an exhibition of lawyers whose rights had been taken away during the war because they were Jewish. And I phoned up the Reverend there, and I said, I've got an envelope addressed from a lawyer where on the outside it's stamped, only allowed to have Jewish clients. It's in the book. And I said, would you like me to bring it? And he said, yes. And I said, and also I've got this record from my mother. So he says, oh, we'd like you to give a talk. And I gave a talk, and I told them about the record. and they played it. And there were about 150 people there. And when it finished, the acoustics were just tremendous in this church. Everybody clapped and they asked for it to be played again. It was fantastic.
How wonderful.
Absolutely. To think that my mother was stopped from singing because she was Jewish, and yet it was being played in a church, in the oldest church in England.
How very meaningful and wonderful that must have made you feel.
Absolutely. Not only that, but last year I was requested to give talks to 4 schools in Saffron Walden, which is near Cambridge. And I gave talks about the book and about myself, and I also then played the record. And the 4 schools got together and said there's a memorial the following week in the church there on Holocaust Memorial Day. Would I come and give a talk and also play my mother's record? And so it was played there as well. And to hear it played in a church is just unbelievable, unbelievable. When you think with such a beautiful voice, and you might hear it if you've got the equipment here, is so fantastic. To think she was stopped from singing with such a voice because she was Jewish, it's just not normal. It's just not normal.
It brings to mind a thought I often have, that Germany, on one hand a country of such great culture, literature, science, music and so forth, was nevertheless a country in which such evil was permitted. The general public basically acquiesced to the will of the Nazis and collaborated, and these atrocities did take place.
Read my book. I'll tell you a story that my father told me. A few things. First of all, when Hitler came to power in 1933, he felt that he was the right man for Germany. There was such depression at that time, and hope that so many people out of work could be lifted up. It was just a mass hysteria. And in fact, when he came out of the concentration camp, he indicated to my mother, before we came to England, it can't get worse. So everybody, even having been in a concentration camp, couldn't believe that it could get any worse. It was just a mass hysteria.
Please give us a final thought you'd like to share with our audience.
For people to be educated about the Holocaust so that it doesn't happen again, that's the most important, I feel. And it can, and through education, through my book, which validates many things, I think it might be possible. By chance, I was in Troy in New York. I don't know if you know it. It's near Albany. It's a very small town. And I was walking along, and a car stopped, and a young lady got out, and she said, "Are you Mr. Kaczynski?" And I said, "Yeah." So she said, "Oh, I just bought your book," because on the back of the book is my photograph in there. So she said, "It's very interesting. Would you like to give a talk in my school?" It's only a high school. So I said, "Sure." Anyway, it was called the Emma Willard School. It's enormous, with tennis courts and swimming pools and everything. And I gave a talk there, just out of the blue. And it is in Barnes & Noble and places like that. So it is getting read a bit more. I'm just hoping that it'll get read more and more in America. I think the education in America, the Holocaust education, is much stronger than in England.
And of course, education is the key. Our friend Danny Spungen also gives the same kind of talks. I want to thank you so very, very much.
Not at all.
For being with
It's
us
a
today.
pleasure. It's
Thank
a
you.
pleasure. More than a pleasure.
Thank you. I'll be right back. This concludes our special report from London, England. I'm Richad Peritz. Thank you for being with us.